All right. If you haven't already, be making your way in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 2. We are resuming in chapter 2 where Solomon is basically carrying out the final wishes of David. And some of these things that David left behind for Solomon to... the task, obviously, that David left behind for Solomon to carry out in chapter 2 are not necessarily easy tasks because we've already had to deal with Solomon executing his older, we would say half-brother, Adonijah. He's already had him executed. He's going to have others executed too in chapter 2. And we keep in mind that all of this is in the context of Solomon trying to firmly establish his rule. And I know sometimes when we say that, we think about somebody who's what we would call a despot, somebody who is a tyrant. But Solomon's not a tyrant, at least not at this point. He is the rightful king, and he, not just to preserve himself, but also to preserve Israel's future as well, needs to deal with several of these individuals that have either shown disloyalty to the house of David or have shown disloyalty to Solomon. And we saw last week, I know we've already mentioned Adonijah. He was put to death, and obviously through one of Solomon's men, Benaiah. We saw that Abiathar is basically going to live under house arrest. At least that's the plan. In verses 26 and 27. Now, in verse 28, and really down through verse 35, we see one of David's longtime servants or military men that's also going to be put to death, and that, of course, is Joab. And as we're going to see, the reasons why Joab will be put to death is not because he had supported Adonijah, but because of things that had happened earlier in life that deal, of course, with the fact that Joab was a man that we have seen was not afraid to take matters into his own hands, and in particular, commit murder. So in verse 28, it says that news came to Joab, for Joab had defected to Adonijah, though he had not defected to Absalom. I'm sorry, I meant he did defect to Adonijah. It was Absalom he did not support. So Joab fled to the tabernacle of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. Now, Joab probably figured out what was going on here. We almost have the picture here that Solomon is going through and sort of step by step having these opponents of either David or himself be put in their place. And Joab, of course, knows that he's also in trouble because he was the one that also helped supported Adonijah. So even though he's not the one that proclaimed himself to be king, if you supported that man, you're also guilty of committing the same crime. And so that is the reason why then Joab goes and flees to the tabernacle of the Lord. Now, we've talked about this before, but what is Joab trying to do here in verse 28? Why does he go to the tabernacle of the Lord? Why does he take hold of the horns of the altar?
He thinks this is a place of protection. This is what Adonijah had done in chapter 1. And Adonijah lived at least got through that day. You know what I mean?
Right. So, go ahead.
So this is his thoughts, at least, that he'll be protected as long as he's there.
Right. That's the idea. Joab is of the opinion, all I need to do is flee to the tabernacle of the Lord, and I will be shown mercy, because that was the custom of the day, right? At least Joab is kind of misapplying this rule, but the idea is that, if you go and take hold of the horns of the altar, we talked about that again, also with Adonijah. The idea is that you're trying to throw yourself at the mercy of somebody else, right? So if Joab's mindset is, if I take hold of the horns of the altar, I'm there in the presence of God, there's no way that Solomon is going to have me executed. Because this was a tradition of trying to of trying to appeal to mercy. The problem is that that idea particularly applied to crimes that were not premeditated. So look for a moment in Exodus chapter 21. And let's look at verses 12 through 14. Now we'll see this again when you get down to verse 32, where Solomon explains the reasoning behind his action. Let me get to it in my Bible. So Exodus chapter 21, and let's read verses 12 through 14. All right, so whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. And that's the understanding of premeditated murder. We keep in mind that that's also the sixth of the Ten Commandments, right? Thou shalt not murder. Which obviously the laws of Israel were much more extensive than that, but the Ten Commandments, again, were sort of the foundation of Israel's law. So it's a foundational principle that everybody understood. So whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. Now what does that mean in verse 13?
Those are cities of refuge. If you accidentally kill somebody, and somebody was going to take revenge, you could flee to those cities and be protected.
Right. The concept there in verse 13, if he did not lie in wait for him, means that this is not a premeditated murder. It indicates to us that what's being talked about there is some type of accidental death. And, that could happen in a number of ways. I believe if a man's, if a man's cattle, for instance, accidentally tramples on his neighbor, that's an accidental death. Now, I think in that case, the ox had to be put to death to appeal or to kind of make amends for what happened to his neighbor. But there are sometimes cases where accidental deaths happen. And in that particular case, God had already appointed the cities of refuge, which you read about in the book of Joshua, where the person that had been responsible for the death could flee and basically be protected as long as he stayed within the city. However, in verse 14, the law said, "But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning or through cleverness, you shall take him from my altar that he may die." Now, that's a case here that is specifically going to apply to Joab, because Joab did willfully attack a person. He willfully committed murder. And yet, even though he goes to the altar, according to Exodus 21 and verse 14, he's got to be taken from the altar and be put to death. And that's going to be the situation that's going to apply with Solomon and Benaiah and Joab. So when we go back to 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 29, Joab is taking hold of the horns of the altar. King Solomon was told that Joab has fled to the tabernacle of the Lord. There he is by the altar. Then Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Joiada, saying, "Go strike him down." So Benaiah went to the tabernacle of the Lord and said to him, "Thus says the king, come out." Of course, we remember that one of the last things that David told to Solomon, right, and that was the beginning of chapter 2, is, if you notice verse 3, that Solomon was to keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. Well, this is a case of Solomon knowing what the law said. I know a lot of times we sort of focus on other aspects of Solomon's life, whether it was him using his wisdom to deduce the correct mother in the situation between the two women fighting over the child. I know we talk about the people that come from around the world to visit Solomon because of his wisdom. We talk about his faults in chapter 10 by the end of his life. This is one of the less widely known, we might say, examples of how Solomon sort of was putting into practice David's charge to know what the law said and then to properly apply it. Because Benaiah is going to have some reservations about this. But Solomon's very, very affirmative here. Even though he's there by the altar, we've got to do something. We've got to punish Joab. So again, Benaiah went to the tabernacle of the Lord and said to him, "Thus says the king, come out." And he said, "No, but I will die here." And Benaiah brought back word to the king, saying, "Thus said Joab, and thus he answered me." Now, of course, some might say that this is not the proper place, right? The tabernacle of the Lord, these are where sacrifices are made. This is where blood is offered for the forgiveness of sins. This is not where blood is supposed to be. This is where the blood of animals is supposed to be shed, not the blood of humans. But Solomon is wise in this regard because, it's one of those cases where as long as Joab stays there, he's fine, if Solomon wants to operate on that principle. But Solomon understands that within any society, somebody who does wrong has to be punished. You can't have a fully functioning society if you let people that commit evil get away with evil. I know a lot of times we don't like to, and it depends on your political beliefs, but, there's some people that believe that, big government's bad. And maybe to a certain extent that's true, but you have to have some form of government in place because government's what funds our police department. It's what funds other aspects of our criminal justice system, right? And people that commit serious crimes, that people that commit murder have to be held responsible for that. If Solomon said, well, we'll just leave him there, I don't necessarily know how it could work, but Joab would have been able to escape punishment as long as he stayed there. And again, this is not an accidental death. This was a case of him committing murder. So Solomon can't let Joab just sort of find this loophole, so to speak, and exploit it and get away with it. So the king said to him, "Do as he said, strike him down and bury him, that you may take away from me and from the house of my father the innocent blood which Joab shed." So Solomon's very clear about this, and we know this has already been true where people have tried to go back in time and put blame on either David or his house for somebody else's crime or for a supposed crime. And we're going to talk about Shimei at the end of the chapter, but we remember that Shimei, when David was on the run, Shimei said, "David, you are having to run, you're having to flee from Israel for what reason?" Yeah, Shimei said, "Look, David, you were responsible for Saul's death. That's why you are having to flee from Israel." In other words, there is innocent blood on your hand, is what Shimei said. Well, we know that wasn't true, and we certainly know that wasn't true because God was with David. However, some might have said, Joab is under David, right? Joab was the commander of the army. Some might have said that, David gave the charge for Joab to go out and to kill Abner, or to go out and kill Amasa, as what's stated in verse 32. However, Solomon's going to make very clear, right, that any connection to my house or my father's house being guilty or caught up in this, we're going to make sure that people know that that's not true, right? We're innocent of that. We're innocent of that because we've dealt with the evildoer. So Benaiah's charge is to go in there and strike him down right there at the horns of the altar, to take away from me and from the house of my father the innocent blood which Joab shed. And the result of that, or the reason for that, again, verse 32, "So the Lord will return his blood on his head because he struck down 2 men more righteous and better than he, and killed them with the sword. Abner the son of Ner, the commander of the army of Israel, and Amasa the son of Jether, the commander of the army of Judah, though my father did not know it. And again, there's Solomon making very clear David did not have a hand in their murder. This is all done based on the desires of Joab. So verse 33, their blood shall therefore return upon the head of Joab and upon the head of his descendants forever. But upon David and his descendants, upon his house and his throne, there shall be peace forever from the Lord. So verse 34, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada went up and struck and killed him, and he was buried in his own house in the wilderness. The king put Benaiah the son of Jehoiada in his place over the army, and the king put Zadok the priest in the place of Abiathar. So even though Joab is basically given a criminal's death, there is certainly the importance of making sure that the body is buried. Obviously, that also deals with principles with the law of Moses. If you leave a body out, and obviously in this situation, you're not going to leave the corpse of Joab sitting there in the tabernacle. They're not going to leave it in the tabernacle. But in this case, Joab actually receives he's actually buried, which we've already seen is very important in the customs of the Israelites, to be buried with the family, but also to have a proper burial as well. Again, we've mentioned before, there are instances in the Bible where individuals have died, like Jezebel falls from the top of a tower, and her corpse is laying there, and the dogs basically eat her up. That was a sign of a very disgraceful death. So even Joab, though, gets a proper burial. One of the larger points, and this is, again, the main theme of chapter 2, is that these individuals had for a time not been punished for their crimes. Maybe they felt like they got away with committing whatever wickedness it might be, whether it's murder, whether it's committing treason. They might have felt as though that they could get away with their sin. But in chapter 2, we are pointed to the very true reality that a lot of times punishment for sin, and in this particular case, physical punishment of sin, sometimes comes later in life. And that's been true for, that's a principle that's sort of been true in other aspects of society, right? There have been people that have almost, that they felt like they got away with murder, but then advances in forensic science and things like that, where you have DNA testing and all that, have led police in some instances to actually discover and arrest people that were guilty of murder 20 to 30 years ago. This is one of the things that I have to bring up this is one of the stories that I bring up when I teach U.S. history, is the death of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young African-American boy that was killed in Money, Mississippi back in the 1950s. He's killed. At least at first, the people that were responsible for his death got away with it. The jury found them innocent, but eventually they were arrested, and the punishment was dealt to them. But the real kicker was, decades later, the woman that had accused Emmett Till of whistling at her, which motivated the murder, came out and said that none of it was true. That what he did is not what she said, which led to his murder. And there were a lot of people really upset by that, because they felt that she should have been punished for making up a lie that led to this boy getting murdered. And that led to a lot of people that are reminded of this, that even if you committed a crime decades ago, if you didn't face justice for it, you still need to face justice for it. It's the idea. And that's true. That's what's actually happening for Joab. Yes, he committed murder years ago, but now he's not going to get away with it, is the point. He's going to face justice for that. All right, are there any comments on verses 28 to 35?
Certainly on the day of judgment, all wrongs will be made right then. Sometimes people think they get away with things in this life, and some may, but you're not going to get away ultimately.
Right. And some people do. Some people do get away with it, in on earth at least. But there's a reason why God is seen as the righteous judge. That's why the Bible depicts him as the righteous judge, because he can both administer punishment and reward individuals with mercy, because he knows all the facts, so to speak. All right, so Joab is executed. Next, Solomon has to deal with Shimei. Verse 36, then the king sent called for Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there, and do not go out from there anywhere. For it shall be on the day you go out and cross the brook Kidron, know for certain you shall surely die, your blood shall be on your head, or on your own head. All right. Why do you think Solomon would give this specific command to Shimei? Build a house at Jerusalem and basically don't leave, is what he's telling him.
It's sort of like house arrest, isn't it? I mean, you got the perimeter, you got to stay within these boundaries. If you leave, then you'll face the consequences.
Right. You face the consequences. If we remember, Shimei is connected to the house of Saul. One thing that we also need to keep in mind about this specific command is that both with Absalom and Adonijah, when it came to them committing rebellion against David, one of the common actions that they took is that they left, or at least, with David in both instances, one of the common actions that they took is that they both left the presence of David to start a rebellion. Again, for Absalom, he went to Hebron, right? So that people would proclaim, it's more true for Adonijah, right? Adonijah leaves, goes to Hebron, right? People go there to proclaim himself as king. And Solomon, perhaps in his mind, is reminded of that, right? Adonijah left David, built up a followers, tried to establish himself as king in Hebron, and he did that in part because he left Jerusalem. He got out of my father's sight. And so Solomon, likewise, doesn't want Shimei to think that he can do something like that, potentially. So that's something to keep in mind about Shimei. It may help us understand why Solomon gives this specific command, build a house in Jerusalem and don't leave. Because if you leave, you could be like Adonijah and try to proclaim yourself to be king, start a rebellion against me. And Solomon doesn't want that to happen. So verse 38, Shimei said to the king, the saying is good, as my lord the king has said, so your servant will do. So Shimei dwelt in Jerusalem many days. Seems like everything's fine. However, we're told in verse 39 that after 3 years, 2 slaves of Shimei ran away to Achish, the son of Maacah, king of Gath. And they told Shimei, saying, look, your slaves are in Gath. So Shimei arose, saddled his donkey, and went to Achish at Gath to seek his slaves. And Shimei went and brought his slaves from Gath. And Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had come back. Then the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, did I not make you swear by the Lord and warn you, saying, know for certain that on the day you go out and travel anywhere, you shall surely die. And you said to me, the word I have heard is good. Why then have you not kept the oath of the Lord and the commandment that I gave you? The king said moreover to Shimei, you know, as your heart acknowledges all the wickedness that you did to my father David, therefore the Lord will return your wickedness on your own head. But King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. So the king commanded Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. Thus the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. So Shimei had made not just a promise, but basically a covenant with Solomon that he would not leave. And that was an unconditional covenant. There was no clause put in that covenant that would, say here are certain exceptions which can allow Shimei to leave. It's an unconditional promise that they have agreed to. And that comes into play because when Shimei leaves Jerusalem, he's not doing this for ulterior motives. He's not doing this like what Adonijah did. He's not doing this like perhaps what others might have done, to use this as an opportunity to gain followers, to try to become a rival to Solomon. He doesn't have any intention of doing that. He simply goes to retrieve the two runaway slaves. And the point being here is that since this was an unconditional promise, it didn't matter what Shimei's reason for. He broke that promise. He broke his word. And for that reason, he's going to be punished for it. Now, some might say that this is not really fair, but again, we keep in mind that all the way back in 2 Samuel, when Shimei pronounced a curse on the house of David, again, saying that David's responsible for Saul's death, that was a form of treason. Treason in most cultures is punishable by death. David chose not to put him to death in that situation. David extended to him mercy. And so Shimei was preserved. Solomon likewise gives Shimei the opportunity, to live in Jerusalem. Continues to extend that mercy. And yet, because he does not keep his word, Solomon then has to go out and deal with Shimei. Obviously, it doesn't look good if a person can make a promise to a king and the person can break that promise and get away with it. Doesn't look good for Solomon. And so Shimei has to be dealt with, and that's why he is going to be put to death. Now, one thing that we can point out here is that, maybe a point of application here, is that there are certain instances where, there is no excuse for not doing the right thing. Shimei, again, could have justified, why he broke Solomon's promise by saying, look, I wasn't trying to start a rebellion. I had a genuine reason to go to Gath, and that should justify me. Well, that doesn't really justify Shimei here because he broke his promise to Solomon. Likewise, we think about this from the perspective of us as Christians. When we're baptized, we agree to, we agree in a sense with a covenant with God. We're baptized, we become Christians. If we wear Christ's name, we agree to not just wear the name, but also to do what God expects of us. And we see that throughout the New Testament. However, we know that our responsibilities as Christians, for instance, we have to meet those responsibilities. There's no excuse for not meeting those responsibilities. For instance, if I say that, I'm an introvert, I'm not great at carrying on conversations with other people. God understands if I'm an introvert that He'll overlook the fact that I don't talk to others about the gospel. I can justify that any way in my mind and have, at least in my mind, a great reason for not doing something that God expects of me, but at the end of the day, God's still going to hold me accountable for not doing what's expected of me. And that's one instance of that. So the overall point is, there's no excuse to not keep your word in this case. There's no excuse for Shimei to not keep his word with Solomon. In a spiritual sense, there's no excuse for us to not keep what we promise in our service to God. Because obviously God values promises just as God's servant Solomon values his promises here. And Again, even though Shimei did not necessarily kill anyone like Joab did, he's also going to be killed because, like others, he failed to take advantage of the mercy that he had been offered by both David and by Solomon. And as we've said before in this chapter sort of hammers this theme down, when you reject the mercy of someone, the punishment is much more severe than it would have been originally in a lot of cases, or at least it could have been. And so ends the life of Shimei. And the overall point is summed up in verse 45, that the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. And then following up in verse 46, thus the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. Now that doesn't mean that Solomon has any problems moving forward. What verse 46 indicates to us is that in the early days of Solomon's rule, once all of these individuals had been executed, there's no doubt about Solomon being the king, right? Because these challengers or these people that had supported a traitor, they're put to death. But the people also know that Solomon is going to deal with traitors in the same way. And again, he's not a tyrant, but all Solomon is trying to do is establish a clear chain of command. God has put me in the position to be king. I'm going to carry out my duties as king, and you need to respect that position that I've been put in. Thus, this kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. All right, with that being said, are there any other comments that you'd like to add on to the end of chapter 2?
Also a reminder that mercy has limits.
Right.
Joab and Shimei and these others have been given mercy time and again, but there comes a time when it runs out. Just same with us. We want to take advantage of God's mercy while we have opportunity. But like I say, one day God's patience and long suffering will come to an end.
And sometimes you see that even in our court system today. Sometimes, and there's a particular judge, he's based out of Rhode Island. I've seen him on YouTube a lot, where sometimes he will, depending on the specific reason, he's very thorough about how he does it. Sometimes he lessens the punishment if there's a very good specific reason for that. But some of those people wind up going out and committing the same crime. Well, when they come back to him again, he's not so nice to them, right? Because, I offered you a little bit of mercy, I've lessened your punishment, you go out and do the exact same thing, it's going to be a lot worse for you this time around. So mercy does run out with people. It also runs out eventually with God as well. But that is a good stopping point. We will pick up in chapter 3, beginning next week, where Solomon will acquire what he's most well known for, and that is his wisdom and wealth. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here. Thank you for your time and your attention. We'll pick up in chapter 3 next week.